In this video, we'll be discussing experimental design. Purpose of an experiment is to test whether or not your hypothesis is supported or refuted by data collected from the real world. And the real goal here is to connect what you predicted is going to happen to the way the universe actually works by collecting real data. This is probably not a very difficult topic to work on throughout the year, but it is something we're going to be dealing with over and over and over again. Every experiment we perform this year, whether it's a formal lab report or not, is going to come back to this experimental design concept. So one not super challenging, it is something you definitely need to make sure that you're comfortable with. So let's get started then. To begin with, we're going to start talking about some specific learning objectives. The first objective is probably one of the more significant of the group. This is going to be the real basis for your experiment, and that is be able to identify what the independent variable is in your experiment and the dependent variable is in your experiment. This is going to connect back a lot to what your hypothesis is going to be about. Secondly, we're going to be talking about controls in your experiment. Controls, in short, are anything that aren't your independent and dependent variable, and we'll talk about what those are and why they're important to pay attention to. And then finally, the goal is to take all that stuff and put it together and be able to design an experimental procedure to test a specific hypothesis. As your hypothesis changes, the experiment changes as well. You need to understand these concepts well enough so that you can design an experiment that connects back to what you're doing. So, if you guys recall from our previous video, we were talking about the scientific method. There's a lot of different ways to represent scientific method. This just happens to be one of them. In this particular video, we are focusing on this part of the method process. At this stage in the game, you should have already constructed a hypothesis, and now you want to test to see if that hypothesis is correct. The results of this test will ultimately be conclusions for your experiment, and the purpose of a conclusion is to say whether or not your hypothesis was right or wrong and what all that really means. And hopefully at this stage in the game, we're going to walk away with a little extra scientific knowledge that we didn't necessarily have before. But again, our purpose today is right here, coming up with a test for our experiment. So let's move on and talk about a quick example to get us back into the thinking of the scientific method. If you recall from the previous experiments, we were talking about baking cookies. And if you recall, the specifics were that I baked a set of cookies, and then you baked a set of cookies, and then we all decided that the cookies I baked tasted better than the cookies you baked. The question is, though, is why? What's different between the two of those? And the explanation that we came up with was that I used butter and you used margarine. And by changing those ingredients, I ended up with a different taste of cookies. So what we changed had an effect on the actual taste. And this is a great basis for an experiment that we can perform that allows us to change some variables, butter versus margarine, and as a result have this affect the taste. And we're going to talk about some specific names for what we call these types of variables versus what we call the variable over here, which is taste. Before we dive into that, I think it's important to also note the fact that butter and margarine aren't the only ingredients involved in baking cookies. We can think of lots of other ingredients involved in this, the type of flour that was used, the brand of chocolate chips that were involved in the process, the temperature of the oven, and each one of these ultimately is going to have an effect on the taste of the cookies themselves. So the question at hand before we move on is, why would I choose butter or margarine versus choosing any one of the other ones down here? Well, the good news is the answer to that question is super simple. It's because that's what you believe as a researcher is the effect that you want to work on right now. You think butter versus margarine affected the taste, so that's the experiment we're going to work on. That doesn't mean that the rest of these guys don't have an impact. That's just not the experiment we're doing right now. And if this were your job, if it were your life coming up with better cookie recipes, you would eventually go on to test all of these guys as well and ultimately come up with the best tasting cookie that could possibly exist in the world. But for now, our experiment focuses just on butter versus margarine. So, moving onwards, let's talk a little bit about what these different variables mean and what we're going to call them a little more officially in future experiments. The first type of variable we're going to be dealing with here is the independent variable in the experiment. The independent variable, the best way to define it right here, is the factor that you purposefully change. We are in control of the independent variable. And the reason we're changing it is we want to see how what we do with the independent variable affects the rest of the experiment. What does it do? If you think back to our previous discussion that we were talking about, the independent variable is associated with the butter versus margarine. By changing the butter and margarine, we're going to affect the outcome of the experiment, which is going to be the taste of our cookies. So that's what our independent variable is. This is the guy that you've decided it has an effect on the results. That brings us then to our dependent variable. The dependent variable is the opposite. It's the factor that changes as a result of what you did with the independent variable. So we changed something up here with the independent variable, and as a result, it affected the dependent variable. The easiest way I think to think of what the dependent variables are is right here. The dependent variable is the result of the experiment. If I have butter versus margarine, the result will be a different, and if we can identify the dependent variable here, the result will be a different taste for our cookies. If you want to get even a little more technical here, the dependent variable is dependent on, that's hence the name dependent variable, what we've done with the independent variable. So at the end of the day, what you get is a direct relationship between what we do with the independent variable and what effect it has on the dependent variable. And that's really what the experiment is designed to figure out. What is the impact the independent variable has on the dependent variable of our experiment? Again, in our case, what is the impact of butter versus margarine overall on the taste of our cookies? Now, there's another group of factors here we have to watch out for, and that last group of factors are known as our experimental controls. An experimental control, as it says right here, is basically all the other factors that could reasonably affect the outcome of the experiment other than the independent variable. So it's basically everything else you can possibly think of that might impact the taste, in the case of the example with the cookies, that we're not necessarily testing. And the reason you want to identify all these guys, by the way, if you remember from before, these are things like the type of flour, the oven temperature, the type of chocolate chips, etc., etc. The reason you want to watch out for these guys is because they need to be kept constant, hence the term controls. If you allow one of these control variables to change during the experiment, it hypothetically could have an effect on taste. It'll have an effect on taste that we can't keep track of, and as a result, we won't know if the taste got better because of the butter versus margarine or because of what we allowed to happen with our controls. By fixing the controls, that means the only things that are changing are butter and margarine versus taste, and we'll definitely know the relationship between the two of those things. This is by far one of the most dangerous parts of the experimental design process. Missing controls, forgetting to conclude those, can give you very misleading results. And in my mind, this is one of the most easy places for you to get in trouble when designing your experiment. And this is the place that scientists throughout history have gotten in trouble with by thinking they've gotten one particular result and only to find out later that's because they didn't control other variables properly and as a result got misleading results. Now let's start talking a little bit about putting this together and actually designing an experiment. So I have another example for you. We're going to use what we've talked about in this observation down below in red, and we're going to design an experiment to test a hypothesis of your creation. You're going to create your own hypothesis explaining what's going on here, and then you're going to design an experiment to test to see if your hypothesis is right or wrong. So in red, in the spring, we planted rows of bean plants. You can see over here in the picture, we've got our rows of bean plants. After a few months of growing, the rows grew to different heights. We got tall bean plants here on the left, and we got itty bitty short little bean plants here on the right, and they seem to go in a pretty smooth pattern from tallest to shortest. The question at hand is why? If they're all the same bean plant, why would we expect some beans to grow higher and some beans not to grow nearly as high? What's different and what's going on here? So your job now is to come up with an experiment that would test, or a hypothesis first, and then a test to explain or to test whether or not your hypothesis is right or wrong. What I want you to do is identify what you think the independent variable is here. What's changing from row to row that's causing the beans to grow to different heights, and then determine what your dependent variable is. Determine your experimental controls and see if you can come up with a methodology for explaining why these plants grew big and these plants did not. Pause the video, jot down a few of these ideas on paper, and then on the next slide we'll go over what the answers are and see if we can come up with a good example of what the solution would be. But it's important to note there's a lot of different answers to this question depending on what you think was the cause. So let's talk about some of the results from our experimental design process here. First thing you're going to probably want to do is identify what types of variables do we have available to us here. What are some things that might affect the behavior of these plants? And I got a brief list of them here, but this is by no means exhaustive. There could be plenty of other options out here. So for example, if you change the amount of sun each plant gets, that would affect how much they grow. Plants need sun. If you change the amount of water, that should affect how much the plants grow. Maybe you use fertilizer and didn't use fertilizer. Maybe they're different species of plants. The quality of the soil, the amount of time that they were in the ground. We're assuming that they all got planted at the same time. Maybe they didn't. As a result, if you look separately here, we got this height of the plant as another kind of variable we can deal with. But notice I kept it separate, and that's for a very good reason. All of these variables, these guys right here, I would describe as potential independent variables. These are things that we can control and change, and as a result, that's going to lead us to this guy, which is our dependent variable. The thing that we're observing happening is that we get different heights of plants. So the question is which one do you think is most likely affecting the height of the actual plant? And this is going to come from the context of you as the person planting the plants. You know, looking at the picture we just had, amount of sun doesn't seem like a likely opportunity because they're all planted in the same location. Likewise, the quality of the soil doesn't seem like a likely solution. But again, you might know something about the quality of the soil that I don't necessarily do. I'm going to focus, just because I chose to, on this variable right here. I'm going to say that plants on one side got more water and plants on the other side got less water. And as a result of that, it has an impact on the height of the plant itself. Maybe when I set up my garden, I put the sprinkler on the left side there, and the sprinkler put more water on the big plants and less water on the small plants. And again, that's because I know that, it's my experience, and that's the thing I'm going to choose as a result. So from this, once you've identified your variables, we can come up with a hypothesis. And that hypothesis is going to look a little something like this. If a bean plant receives more water, then it will grow to a larger height because water is needed for a healthy plant. There are lots of different ways to structure a hypothesis statement, but notice I use the if, then, and because format. I think this is a very simple way to structure things, and it reminds you of the things that you need to do. It also connects very nicely back to our ideas of independent versus dependent variable. The if always corresponds to what the independent variable is. So whatever your if is, that corresponds to your independent variable. The then statement always corresponds to your dependent variable. If I change this, then I will get a different height as a result of that. And the because is an explanation as to why you think that's going to occur. It's a reasonable scientific explanation. So again, I think the nice thing about the if then because format is it connects us right back to the idea of independent versus dependent variables. So I identify the amount of water as my independent variable. It's my choice. And as a result, I'm expecting to get different heights of plants. The rest of these guys then become controls. So this guy, the amount of fertilizer used, the species of plants, all of these factors have to be controlled in the experiment. If you change the quality of soil, we won't know if the plant height was different because of how much water we had or because of the quality of the soil that we use. So these guys have to be held constant. So these become our controls. So amount of water is our independent variable. Height of the plant is our dependent variable, and then everything else we can think of ends up being our controls for the experiment. So once you've got the variables identified, once you've got a hypothesis put together, the last step in the process is then to put it all together into an actual procedure that we can use. This again is going to come down to how you want to design the experiment and what you're trying to prove in the process. But some general things for this particular one that I would use would be something along these lines. First of all, you'd want to have a large number of plants. The more samples you take, the end result is going to be the less likely some kind of weird outcome that's going to ruin your experiment. If you have 100 plants in your experiment and one of them does something really strange, like turn into a pumpkin tree or a pumpkin plant, then the end result is going to be it's not a big deal out of 100 plants. But if one of them turns into a pumpkin and you only did 3 samples, that's 33% of your sample size, and that's going to be a huge problem. So a large number of bean plants, as large as reasonable for what you're doing. Each plant has to receive a different amount of water, or maybe even group them. Maybe you have groups of 10 plants, and each 10 plant receives the same amount of water, and then the next group of 10 plants receives the same amount of water. And again, the larger sizes of your samples is going to reduce error in your experiment. To measure this experiment, you have to measure those heights. That's the result of the experiment. You're probably going to measure those heights as regularly as possible. I don't know if every day necessarily makes sense, but maybe every week. And then again, making sure everything else, the amount of sunlight, the quality of the soil, every other factor is held constant. Maybe to make it super duper constant, use a greenhouse instead of the outside air to make sure that you keep things relatively consistent throughout the duration of the experiment. But anyway, these are the kind of things you want to think of. And again, it's just coming up with some steps and some ideas that again correspond back to keeping your controls in line and only allowing your independent variable to change and seeing what effect it has on your dependent variable. Again, I feel for most students this is not a topic people struggle with that much, but if you are having trouble with, this is something you can discuss with me in class. We'll be doing this experimental design process over and over throughout the year, so you have plenty of chances and opportunities to get better and better with it.